She left it all behind, the old apartment, the soul-draining job, the blood-soaked love, and her mother's photo still lingering in the faint scent of incense. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't look back. That city, once a place of love, was now just a graveyard for unheard cries. They called her a runaway. But even she didn't know if she was running from the pain. Or from the person she couldn't forgive, herself. And used to be someone who seemed okay, at least in the eyes of others. A well-known editor, living in a small apartment filled with books, drinking black coffee with no sugar, and loving a man polished enough to put her mother at ease. But everything fell apart in a single rainy season. Her mother died in a late-night traffic accident, hit by a reckless truck. That mother, the only one who ever listened to and cry without asking why, left quietly, as if she had never been. 3 days after the funeral, and found out the man she loved had a whole other family. She didn't cry. She just packed up her things, threw out everything once called memories, and locked her heart the way you'd lock a room reeking of decay. Work stopped being an anchor. Every line she edited lost its meaning. Other people's stories couldn't save her from the rot inside her own. Every morning felt like dragging herself out of a void. Every night was a battle with memory. The city felt cramped and cold. Friends drifted away, or pretended not to see her falling. Then came the chest pains. The doctor said it was nothing, just stress. But that just stress made her collapse on the sidewalk, gasping like the air had turned to water. Once, she almost stepped onto the tracks before the train arrived. Not because she wanted to die, but because she couldn't find a reason to stay still. And then, on a quiet winter morning, without a word, and left the city. No notes. No goodbyes. Just a few old clothes and a small backpack. She walked away like someone with nothing left to lose. But in that very moment, the journey to find herself began. And arrived in a quiet coastal town, where the waves crashed loud enough to drown out every sound from the past. She rented a small room behind a family-run diner, peeling walls, a window facing the sea, and a bed that creaked every time she turned over. But there, she could finally breathe. No one knew who she was, and no one asked where she came from. Each day, she washed dishes, swept the yard, helped in the kitchen. At night, she lay still, listening to the waves break on the shore like layers of her heart slowly cracking open. Days passed slowly, monotonously, but they were real. No more meetings, no more pitying looks, no more faces pretending to care. She learned how to live without needing to be seen. She bought an old notebook and started jotting down small things. The smell of grilled fish in the afternoon, the shimmer of sunset on the water, the sound of children laughing in the alley. Things she used to think were meaningless became quiet milestones of a silent kind of rebirth. Then in met Dung, a boat repairman, quiet, reserved, with eyes that had seen too much but didn't pry. They didn't talk much about the past. They shared silences, sometimes a glass of cheap rice wine, sometimes a brief laugh after a meaningless story. One day, Dung said, "Not everyone comes here to live. Some just come to forget." And didn't reply, but the words settled inside her like an anchor finally hitting bottom. She also met Bina, a little orphan girl who lived with her grandmother and often ran to the diner to play. The child's eyes reminded her of herself, back when her mother was still alive, back when she still believed everything would be okay. In these strangers, and began to see reflections of herself. Each person was running from something. But somehow, they were still living. And not blaming the world for it. They never said it aloud, but in their quiet ways, they taught her how to exist again. One breath at a time. One rainy afternoon, Bina came down with a high fever. Her grandmother panicked, no transportation, no idea what to do. Dung was still out at sea. Without thinking, An scooped the little girl into her arms and asked a neighbor to drive them both to the clinic nearly 20 kilometers away. In that moment, she wasn't someone running anymore. She was someone holding a small, burning life in her arms, trembling but alive. Na was saved. She clutched An's hand through the injection, sobbed hard, then fell asleep on her shoulder. That night, as An sat by the hospital bed with the rain still falling heavily outside, she felt her own eyes fill. Not from fear. but because, for the first time in months, she could feel her heart beating again. Everything felt different after that. Not because the town changed, but because she did. She began to talk more, laugh more. Dung noticed, just nodded quietly, never asked. One day, while they were painting an old boat together, she suddenly started telling him about her mother, the accident, the grief, the hollowed-out feeling that nothing could ever fill. Dung didn't comfort her, didn't interrupt. He just handed her a plank of wood and said, "Patch the empty part with this." She laughed a real laugh. In his quiet simplicity, she understood something. Pain doesn't disappear, but it can be repaired. Bit by bit. And started writing again. Not cold editorials or abandoned novels, but honest words. About waves. About wind. About the quiet people who keep living and hoping, even after they've been broken. And in every line she wrote, she wasn't writing to forget anymore. She was writing to understand. To understand this. Running never erases the wound. Only when you face it can healing begin. One early spring morning, Dung placed a bus ticket in front of him and said simply, "Go back." Not to stay, just to prove to yourself that you can return without falling apart. She was silent for a long time. This small town, the quiet people, and little Bina who had just recovered, they had all become part of her. But deep down, she knew, she needed to return to where it all began. In order to truly end it. After nearly a year of disappearance, and went back to the city. Almost nothing had changed, the same cold buildings, the same hurried faces, the same dusty old apartment. She unlocked the door and stepped inside the room where she had once collapsed through her darkest nights. But this time, no panic. No dread. Just an old space. Waiting to be put back in order. She visited her mother's grave. Didn't cry. Just sat there, quietly, for a long time. Telling her about the little diner, about the sea, about Dung, about Bina. For the first time, she didn't speak with the voice of a victim, but of a survivor. She said she was sorry. For wanting to disappear. For not being strong enough to stay. But then she also said thank you. Because it was through that pain that she had finally learned how to see herself. She met her ex again. He was stunned, awkward, stumbling over apologies. And simply smiled, gently, but firmly. That's all in the past. No tears. No anger. She realized then. Forgiveness isn't for the other person's peace. It's for your own release. Before leaving the city, and returned to her old editorial office. She met with the editor who once believed in her. And left behind a manuscript. Her first collection of personal essays since the long silence. The title, "Those Who Stay Silent Are Still Alive." And as she stepped out of that building, sunlight fell gently across her shoulders. Not dazzling, but enough to know she had truly returned. Not as someone broken, but as someone stitched back together. Stronger than ever before. And returned to the coastal town on a windswept afternoon. Bina came running, throwing her arms around her, chattering nonstop as if afraid and might disappear again. Dung just looked at her and nodded, a quiet nod that held everything, welcome, understanding, and no need for explanation. She didn't say anything. Everything that needed to be said had already been left behind. In the city. At her mother's grave. In that calm handshake with the man who once broke her. Now, she chose silence. To begin again. In the place that had held her when she no longer knew who she was. And asked to teach writing at a small school for underprivileged kids in the fishing village. Children with ink-stained hands and eyes full of dreams. In them, she saw a version of herself uncertain, a little lost, but still burning with hope. Each class, she told them stories of ordinary people with wounds, who still chose to live, who still chose to love. In the evenings, she worked at the diner again, sometimes writing under the warm flicker of the old yellow light. Her manuscript was republished by the editorial house, and unexpectedly well received. But this time, it didn't feel like a triumph, just a mile marker. Success was no longer salvation. Writing was no longer about proving anything. It was simply a way to live truthfully. Done and stayed the same. No promises, no bindings. But they had each other in the quiet things. A hot meal, a glance that said enough. Early mornings at the fish market. She didn't call it love. She just knew that next to him, she felt at peace. Sometimes, she sat alone by the sea, watching the waves come in, then draw away. Like all the losses she'd once carried, the past no longer made her panic. It was simply part of her. Like a scar. Not ugly. Just a reminder. She had been hurt. And she had survived. Foreign. To keep living didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to stay. With herself. And this time, to truly be herself. On a windless early morning, and stood before the sea, bare feet pressed into the cool sand, listening to the waves like the heartbeat of the world. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, not to forget, but to remember. The past hadn't disappeared. It was still there, quiet as the layers of rock beneath the ocean. But now, it no longer pulled her under. It had become the ground she stood on. She had run. She had fallen. She had shattered. But in that seemingly aimless journey, she found herself. In ordinary people. In silent moments. In a heart that had learned how to forgive. And love again. And if you, too, are feeling lost, carrying a wound no one else can see, remember this. You are not weak because you're in pain. You're simply being real. Keep going, even if it's slow. Because sometimes, just the act of breathing, of facing what hurts, means you're already stronger than everything that tried to break you. And kept living. And so will you.